Hello, everyone. I'll just give you a few seconds to log on. Thank you for your patience. We were just getting some technical things sorted at our end, but I hope everyone has a glass of something in hand and is feeling comfortable and ready for this evening's seminar. My name is Sarah Turner, and I'm the director of the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art. I'm really delighted to welcome so many of you to this online event to celebrate and reflect on the completion of the revision of the Buildings of England series. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I can see lots of people and the numbers creeping up all the time. So with the publication of the volume on Staffordshire this year, we were delighted to announce and celebrate the completion of the monumental task of revising all of the original Pevsner Architectural Guides to the Buildings of England. It's a project which began in 1983 with the publication of the new volume for South London. And in total, 58 fully revised and updated guides have been published in the English series. And in the same period, 15 volumes have been published for the buildings of Scotland, 7 for the buildings of Wales, and 13 guides to the cities of England, as well as 4 volumes in the buildings of Ireland series and 1 for the Isle of Man. So I think monumental is truly the right word. And Yale University Press and the Paul Mellon Centre are extremely proud to have partnered on this landmark achievement of scholarship and publishing, fulfilling Nicholas Pevsner's aspirations for the future development of the guides for a new generation. And such a complex publishing task has been made possible by the commitment of the joint series editors, Simon Bradley and Charles O'Brien, who, as well as writing and editing volumes themselves, have overseen the work of a large group of authors and photographers for more than 2 decades. So I'm really delighted that they've agreed to share their reflections with us tonight. And it offers me the opportunity to congratulate them and thank them again. And we're also really pleased to be joined by the architectural historian, Jeremy Musson, for this discussion. And I think you can read their biographies online on the Paul Mellon Centre website, as well as Yale University Press's website and site dedicated to the Pevsner series. I've just got a few housekeeping comments to make before I hand over to Jeremy, Charles and Simon. So these are our Zoom housekeeping guidelines. So you'll be automatically muted when you join the webinar. The talks will be followed by time for question and answer session, where we will invite you to contribute to the discussion and to ask questions. You can do this by using the virtual raise hand button if you have a question or comment to make, and we can unmute you so you can speak to our panelists live. But you may also just wish to type your question in the Q&A box, and that will pop up for us as well. You can use our chat box to make general comments, which can be seen by everyone, but questions to the speakers should be put directly in the Q&A box. And any offensive behaviour will not be tolerated, and attendees can be removed from the webinar by the host, but I'm sure that will not happen, and we will look forward to a very collegial and interesting event to celebrate and reflect. So Jeremy, I'm going to hand over to you and to Simon and Charles now. So it's great to have you here with us this evening, and over to you.
It's a great privilege for me to be with these 2 great titans of British architectural history, who I've known for a long time and admired their extraordinary contribution through the Pevsner series and so much more. And they, as well as all their work there, I think they're highly respected in other ways for their advice and their educational roles also. I think when we discussed how we might do this, it seemed very sensible to invite each of these great figures to introduce themselves and say a little opening statement about their connection and their role and their feelings about their contribution. So that's how we thought we'd begin. And then I have some questions arranged for them, which I think will give us a good journey through the foothills and the mountains of the challenges that they have met so handsomely in this wonderful project. So, gentlemen, over to you for this first session.
Simon is going first.
Well, I'm Simon Bradley. I joint series editor with Charles. I have slightly longer service with the series. I joined in January 1994, but in a fairly junior capacity. I was a researcher for the City of London volume, which was a one-year contract, but then it turned out was kept on to write the City of London volume and then took over editorial roles from there. So it was a sort of several steps in, but it was an enormous thrill to get the post, even for a year's worth of research, because I knew the series very well. I was at that point doing finishing a PhD in the Gothic Revival, so I was thinking about buildings, historic buildings of England across England, and I had perhaps, not exceptional, but helpful early exposure to the books, because when I was starting to become interested in buildings around the age of 16 or 17 in the Northeast, we had the Northumberland and Durham volumes in the house. By stroke of luck, they'd been given to my father when he started work with the Coldwood by a senior enthusiast who thought that as a newcomer to the region, he should learn where he was and what was what. So the Northumberland volume had been published then, probably only a few weeks or months before, but there it was in the house, ready and waiting.
Thank you. Well, so it's interesting to think that you arrived with your role in the pages of Pevsner, from the pages of Pevsner at an early age. That's wonderful. How about you, Charles?
Well, I joined the series actually only a few years after Simon. I joined in 1997, it was really my second job, actually. I'd left university in 94. I'd had 3 years working for the Historic Buildings Department of the National Trust in their southern region, having been an art history graduate from UCL. And so I started working in that sort of southern bit of England, which is where I was also brought up, and in Surrey. And I suppose my sort of first encounter with Pevsner was not sort of dimly aware of this authority, because I grew up in Thursley, which was where Lutyens had been brought up, so that kind of loomed large in the local history, but also that you were aware that people talked about certain buildings locally, and it wasn't obvious to me then, but later I realized that it was because it was in the Buildings of England. So in our local town in Godalming, the police station, which was a late 60s work by the county architect, people were always sort of talking about it, and obviously were aware that it was sort of important, even if they hated it. And it was quite a sort of unusual building, now gone, in fact. And I realised, much later, of course, it was in the second edition of Surrey that Bridget Cherry had revised. So it was always sort of there. And I think actually the other thing is that I started studying art history as an A-level student and got interested in architecture then. And of course, Pevsner's outline was the sort of, standard issue still then in the mid-80s, and Pioneers. And I think I got a thoroughly sort of Pevsnerian, education about what mattered, even then, so I must have used the books, I think, in my first job. And then, of course, when the actual vacancy came up for the research assistant with the series, I did have an idea, but I didn't know the half of it, really.
But also there's a sense that you see how Pevsner was not a collection of facts, but a set of arguments as well, in what you've just described. You're aware of that at quite an early age, I think.
Yeah.
From what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And I think that might be a good point for me to ask my first question of you, if that seems timely, because it does lead rather neatly on to just for us to think for a moment about Pevsner himself, and what the significance of his achievement and his legacy, both in the past and through you, the present. How do you place Pevsner in the story of things?
Well, I suppose we see him now perhaps in two ways. One as a historical figure who did a great many things as well as the buildings, books. He was an absolute powerhouse and worked extraordinarily hard. There's the Pelican History of Art series, but then there are all his other writings and publications, all his activities, his service on committees and public bodies and so on. For good reason. Well, there you see Susie Harris' splendid biography of Pevsner, and see how thick the spine is. Because there was a lot to explain, a lot to explore. But then, of course, now when we say Pevsner, it's also shorthand for the series, and the fact that he, during his own lifetime, took steps to ensure that the series would have a continuing life, and that then his successors have taken the concept and broadened it and made it more comprehensive and more up to date, and of course extended it also beyond England. Then there is that other sense of Pevsner being an authority, a source, a resource, as well as the person whose blue plaque we see here.
How you see him, Charles?
Yeah, and I think that in a way that, I mean, such a sort of treat working for buildings of it is the fact that, I mean, obviously Simon and I are too young to have ever known him, but of course we were working with and for people who had, and so you got a much more sort of rounded kind of view of the man than the sort of profiles that will occasionally appear in the press. And but I mean, always just this absolute kind of wonderment, really, at his work ethic, really, and approach to it, and this, the fact that you could measure his achievement in the number of books, but that there was this, whole other aspect to his life, as Simon says. So. Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible legacy and an extraordinary thing to literally follow in the footsteps of.
And it was his own idea, the Buildings of England series, is that right? Tell me a bit about how it came to be. I mean, we're all so familiar with it, but it's an extraordinary thing that it happened.
Yes, and when he came to England as a refugee, essentially in the 30s, he was conscious of the lack of an authoritative series of architectural guidebooks along the lines of the Hea series, which were by then quite well established in Germany. So even in the 30s, he was developing ideas for an equivalent series, which he would write himself. And he got as far as pitching the idea to Cambridge University Press, you might say, of all people, just before the Second World War broke out, and then he was interned as an enemy alien. And by the time the war ended, he'd sort of reinvented himself, really, with these much wider connections with the architectural press, but also with Penguin Books and Alan Lane. So it could become a work of popular publishing, and the Penguin connection was essential there. But even in the, I think quite often overlooked, but in the very last volume of all in sequence, Staffordshire, published 50 years ago, 1974, as well as the usual sort of dedications and so on, there is a little quotation from De Hea explaining De Hea's own purpose in starting his own series in 1897, translated helpfully into English. Yes. So he had the De Hea series in mind at the end as well as at the beginning.
Oh, fascinating. And that point you make about it being both scholarly and popular is one of his special characteristics, the series' special characteristics, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
If I had to pin a pin for the legacy, it would be the combination of those two things, the communication of real authority and knowledge to a popular audience.
Yeah. No, I think that is so important. But I was going to say that I had a sort of lovely moment in preparing the last book that I revised for the series for Surrey, of realizing that the house that Alan Lane owned in the bit of Middlesex that went into Surrey in the 60s at Stanwell, that his house is still there. And it's quite well hidden behind later developments. And it's in a terrible position now because it's on the edge of the Heathrow runways. But this was where Pevsner had gone down on a weekend to sort of pitch Lane his ideas. And so it was kind of funny standing in the garden where they'd had this, momentum in retrospect conversation about doing the series.
And before we move on from the sort of man himself, how did those two meet? Pevsner and Alan Lane, do we know?
I should know this. It must have been the King Penguin series, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But the editor of the King Penguin series was killed in an air raid.
Right.
And Pevsner was asked to take over. But Alan Lane must have known who Pevsner was
to
have done it. I wonder, it might have been through the circles around the Architectural Review and J.M. Richards,
right,
who was also an author of The Pelican, the Penguin non-fiction series. And perhaps Richards recommended Pevsner as a potential author because
I mean, I only ask because I think he also deserves the credit for the vision of the series. It's easy to underestimate the role of the publisher who brought that thing to be. Well, not easy to underestimate, but I mean, I think that's a real credit to him to bring about this thing and Penguin.
Yeah, and of course, and that was obviously the Penguin ability to set a strong design identity for the series early on, which lasted right through all of the editions.
Now, I know the question everyone asks is always, what did Pevsner say? But what does he say? But I know that there were other people who, before your key role from the 90s, who helped keep the series ticking over, updated, moving on. And I thought maybe you could tell me something about those people as well.
Yes. Well, I hear you see, or perhaps one slightly obscured, but the three the most important authors or editors in the series from the late 60s into the 90s of the generation before. There's the late John Newman, who almost uniquely, I think, was both an author of revised volumes in the first and the second series. So John wrote the Kent volumes, and Pevsner identified John as he wrote to Alan Lane, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, then John will finish the series off. So this was quite late in the sequence, sort of around 1970. But John did two Kent volumes, as well as co-author of the Dorset volume, and then later came back to revise his own Kent volumes, but also to do Shropshire, which was one of Pevsner's sort of late 50s volumes. And John doing that really as a retirement project from when he left the Courtauld Institute. Then our good friend and former colleague Bridget Cherry, who retired from the series more than 20 years ago now, but so saw through the transition from the relatively small-scale revisions in the late 60s when she started to the full revisions, which we've now completed from the 1980s onwards. And Elizabeth Williamson, who worked for the series from the early 70s through to the later 90s, and is the author of quite a few distinguished revisions in both, again, the smaller format and the larger format.
And do you have a sense of what they brought as individuals to this continuing process? Did they bring new ways of looking at things, new ways of investigating?
Yes, and I think actually particularly Bridget and Elizabeth, who were obviously there at the point at which the revision started to take on a more substantial character. I mean, I know that they would often say that they were under fairly strict limits in the very early small format revisions, but that over time obviously became more confident and expanding, especially once the new format had been adopted. But I do think particularly quite aside from their own interest, that what was so valuable is that as the books developed, their interest in the 20th century and post-war architecture meant that sort of mission that Pevsner had established in the original volumes of being interested and up to date and thoughtful about the present or recent past, really established as being a sort of key feature of the books. And that went wider into the sort of general culture, I think, through their contributions to the books.
Well, I have enormous respect for all of them, and of course had the pleasure of working with Elizabeth on her final volume in Sussex West, which is again tremendous honour. Only we should spend more time together in the Morris Minor in the series, the earlier series. A wonderful person to work with, and a wonderful. I'm very fascinated, and I think we'll come to it a bit later. But the sort of way that people learn to express the architectural sort of observation. There's so much observed detail in what you achieve in the series, which is so wonderful.
Absolutely.
Let's think a bit before that about the nature. So the series is really county guides historically. And how has that sort of shaped the identity of the buildings of England, being that sort of county format?
Yeah, strongly. I mean, by accident or other, I think in retrospect turned out to be an incredibly good idea to adhere to the essentially adhere to the county boundaries as they were before 1974 and the sort of shake up, because it was already obvious that in the 60s, when there were attempts to kind of stay abreast of boundary changes, that you could be caught out quite badly when it then changed back or changed in a different way a couple of years later. So, but I think, the obvious answer in a way is that, of course, it was very sensible and sort of meaningful to stick to those boundaries because, they relate to the historical records. There are all sorts of ways in which, a county is understood. And even if the actual way that they're administered internally has changed multiple times, people still have an idea of what the county is really, I think. So I think it was important. I would say, seeing that Lancashire is on screen, the title of that, Lancashire, Manchester and the South East, is partly the result of that. Obviously, originally Manchester was, like Liverpool, was wrapped up into the South Lancashire book. Somebody got wind of or at least was a society called the Red Rose Society, I think, who wrote to us to say they were worried that we might produce something called Greater Manchester, and that Lancashire would sort of disappear. And we never knew that such a society existed.
Yes, and they were back in touch when we came to do a volume with the controversial title Cumbria, because of course Cumbria is a new 1970s county composed of the old counties of Cumberland and Westmoreland and the Furness division of Lancashire north of the Sands. So we had a volume called Lancashire North, which, by our own terms, and perhaps this is a bit naughty, did not include the old Furness division. I mean, all this was explained, of course, within the books. But it was helpful that Pevsner had said in his own volume, which was called Cumberland and Westmoreland, because it only covered those 2/3 of the Lake counties, that really it should have done them together with the Furness division of Lancashire, but it didn't work out in terms of the visiting and the research programme and the rest of it. So we could quote that in our defence. But generally we had, as Charles says, our Berkshire is the historic Berkshire. And that's an instance where the subdivision has endured, likewise, Hampshire and Dorset trading sections. But then there are the places where the new county just has evaporated. So, Humberside and Cleveland and so on. And it would have been catastrophic for the revision process if they would try to accommodate those changes and changes back.
But I think it's enormously significant that people do have these regional guides that are equal across the nation, if you like, across the countries that form the nation, are your area guide, your area point of reference. And I think many people have not yet discovered all the wonderful essays at the beginning, which are all about the evolution of a particular area, its geology, history, its architectural history more generally, which actually by themselves, you talked about somebody kindly giving your dad one when he arrived and saying, and even if you'd only read the introductory bit and not looked at the buildings, you would be well informed about the place where you had chosen to live.
Yes.
And I think there's a sort of whole entity to it. Also, for me, being a sort of crumbly historian, I rather like the fact that they do have a bit of an echo of the great county sort of antiquarian studies of history. They sort of feel like they belong on the same shelf almost to what's it, Rudder of Gloucestershire and what's he called in Kent? You know, they all have these people who
Hested, isn't it?
Hested, yes, Hested of Kent. You know, and I don't know about you, but I'm continually finding new things in these ancient guides, bits of descriptions of families and buildings that you didn't realise were actually in print anywhere, and there they are in the 18th century.
And one would often stumble across these things in doing the research, the things you assumed weren't of any value, but actually extraordinary what they contain.
Of course, the screen shows two of the city guides, of which we published 11, I think, in the early parts of this century, having identified, I suppose, that there's an interest and an appetite for that sort of urban exploration, and the new format that was created at the end of our time in Penguin Books to make that possible, but also with a sense that each volume, in almost every case, should be a bridgehead towards a fuller county revision.
Yeah.
And it was always nice coming back to a county where there was already a city guide that could be sort of folded in. It speeded things up.
So did doing the city guides change the series in other ways? I mean, that's quite an interesting aspect you've just mentioned, but did it sort of change the approach, the feel?
I think in a way that the hardbacks, retain their kind of distinctive feel. I think it was in a way the other way around, was that obviously the city guides made it possible to sort of liberalize and sort of liberate the content, present it in a different way, more oriented to the visitor, and of course, I mean, the kind of revolution of being able to bring color, integrated color photos onto the page, and focus on things that were of particular relevance to that city as topics. So I mean, they were a great sort of liberator, and of course, actually, Simon says, a bridgehead to then revising what were by that point very, very old books for the counties. But of course, the principal thing was that it brought out of the woodwork authors for these city guides, who then went on to, some of them, to do multiple, like Claire Hartwell for Manchester, to do multiple revisions of the hardbacks, and so in a way that was that helped secure the actual completion of the books, suddenly having this greatly expanded author.
It's kind of its own sort of training ground for the role, because it takes a bit of getting used to, doesn't it? The whole process. Well, I think actually that probably brings us quite nicely to that question of, you've been involved since the 90s, you've brought this wonderful revision of the series to a close. Makes me wonder, how has researching them changed in those decades?
Enormously. Yeah. Well, I mean, when I started, I was the research assistant, and the kind of way I went about research was probably fairly similar to the way that Pevsner's researchers had worked in the in the 1950s, in that it was about extracting and collecting information in libraries, in drawings collections, in county record offices, and so on. I mean, it was all very traditional, and really still, even in the mid-90s, the kind of digital impact had yet to be felt in a significant way. And bearing in mind, I mean, when Simon and I joined Penguin, just the office kind of setup was still very much early technological.
Emails?
Just about.
Yeah.
Certainly pre kind of Microsoft, there were I think we had our own kind of system at Penguin, didn't we, for a bit?
There was an internal thing, yes.
Yeah.
And people still sent memos, which were
absolutely
pieces of paper which shuffled around the building.
And you sent lots of letters out with queries to people. So it was very different. And the research, so I mean, over time, that has been totally revolutionized, really. So
the illustrations to show the the way in which the new doesn't quite supersede the old, but comes to sort of expand at its expense, you might say. Anyway, there are a huge pile of the Victoria County history volumes, which are still absolutely essential to the work right up to the end. I mean, Staffordshire was a live county for the VCH, and our late author Chris Wakeling worked closely with some of the VCH people there. But quite a lot of those volumes are now available online. So the actual your encounters, your time you spend with the hard copy volumes, therefore, is that much the less. They go on publishing them, and I hope they'll go on until they're finished. But you don't have to go to the library or buy them.
No.
And research used to be about going to the library. I remember, typically Charles or me coming into the office for a bit and then going out to the library, because that's where that part of the work was done. And there were the things which you could do in the library, such as looking at microfilm of historical newspapers, which is extraordinarily slow and cumbersome, and you could only do it in the library during opening hours. But then wonders, the British Newspaper Archives has started digitizing newspapers. And not only, can you do them at home and midnight and whatever you want, you can search for text and search for names and things like that, which in the old days you could only really grind through. So an enormous leap there. And I think the newspaper archive was refining or solving so many problems. And sort of, in a way, I wish we could do the theories again once they've finished digitizing all the newspapers there have ever been. But of course, will never happen.
And it will explain certainly why in the volumes from, say, 2010 onwards, probably, the numbers of names to put against local buildings, as it were, went up enormously. I suppose the other thing is that, as well as the research, the actual editing was also impacted by this sort of leap forward, because it became possible, especially once we were in the era of having lots of authors working around the country and not just in England. So sending you text about places that you had never been to, that once Google Street and things like that were available, the actual ability to do the perambulation on the editor's desk and actually check information, that really altered things. Probably some of the authors weren't actually that grateful for how much we could see. But actually, the one thing I would say is a sort of negative about the digital age, though, when I started, one of the jobs that I had was to take in each week copies of Building Design or the Architect's Journal and mark them up and chop them up and put them in the files. Because what people may not realise is that once a county had been finished, say in 1970, a file opened, and into that went all the letters, notes, cuttings of any relevance. So over 50 years, that's a lot of boxes of cuttings. And actually the advance in turning print things like Building Design into digital actually completely spoiled that. It was impossible to kind of extract without a lot more effort than scissors and paste. And so in a way, I was quite glad we got almost to the end before that really, that changed.
Yes, I mean, one of the downsides of these wonderful new boundaries that have been broken by digital opportunities is the infinite nature of that library. You could now, now there is not going to be a limited number of books. There is actually an infinite amount of possible information that you might come across, and quite a lot you wish you hadn't. But I don't mean that in any sort of sinister way, but you get a lot of second-hand information.
Yes.
So it's always about drilling down to the valuable documentary source like this. That's the point. But fascinating. In Sussex, there were one or two villages that had extraordinarily good websites.
Yes.
Of village history, where they were adding documents all the time.
Yeah.
It was really very interesting how that's changing knowledge and sharing knowledge in these kind of architectural, topographical sort of arenas. And from research, then the writing. Perhaps we'll talk about that rather than the editing right now, because I think writing is such, or the written text of the Buildings of England series is such a distinctive thing, isn't it? It's like, it's probably a sort of word for it in the English language, which is about, Pevsnerism, but yeah, it's a compact, information heavy, but given to moments of lightness in order to engage the reader, I would say. But there's, as I'm having been an author under your electronic pen, the contraction is the thing that takes you by surprise when you start writing. That you, particularly if someone who's used to slightly more longer form writing like me. I think it's worth us reflecting for a bit on the nature of the Buildings of England as a text and how that comes about and how you feel about it as writers and editors. You have the unique position of everyone.
Yeah. Well, I suppose Pevsner might not have had the courage to come up with this quite distinctive and personal, you might say, while he was the only person doing it, way of writing. If it hadn't been for the existence of the Hea Guides, which I think are rather similar. But he wanted to enliven it, so he would look for vivid or sometimes slightly recherché terms to catch your attention and make you think. And he always wanted people to look and think. And I think that the text was designed to engage with that sense of looking, and rather than a sort of an assembly of information about a building, as say a listing description would be. No criticism of listing. Pevsner would try to either reproduce or stimulate an experience of looking, and that extends both to the way he might describe a multi-phase historic building and typically a medieval parish church, but also to the way he would take you down the street or take you around a town or a village in the perambulation section, and what's next, what's this, what's that. And another rule was which Bridget taught us was it should read okay aloud. You should hear the voice in your head. And I think his texts stand up to that. You can imagine a certain sort of rhythm, and what's the word?
Cadence.
Yes. When you read through them, however abrupt they may seem at first.
Yeah, and it was a very good discipline to acquire, and being able to because I think you were always quite conscious that even though you obviously had room to add and expand, that it was important not to drift too far away from that approach, really. And in a way, one felt most satisfied when you could see that you had managed to supplement, but it wasn't actually terribly obvious where the joins were. And sometimes even now, sort of looking back, I'm not really quite sure what is him and what's me. Sometimes, and other times, obviously, it's glaringly obvious. But it was a very good discipline to learn that ability and the sort of importance of the sort of telegraphic kind of account of a building.
I think, what's the word? Being brief in your English description of things is a virtue, isn't it? It's war on the adjective, or Orwell said something like that. I think that you want to get directly to it, but if you use an adjective, it's got to be exactly the right one, and to have the difference that Simon was describing, sort of catching you. That's what it's like to look at this thing.
Yes. Yes.
I do think every now and then in Pevsner, sometimes you move in the early Pevsners, you will find you go from the very contracted text to a bit of very sort of illuminating description of space, which is quite unexpected. It's not in the cathedrals and things like that. He's very good on encounter, I think.
Yes, and good too at where necessary or valuable, giving you a historical framework. So why was St Paul's rebuilt? Well, and how what was the process of arriving at the design? I mean, that was the distillation of a great deal of scholarship and story, and actually very, very well done, because you need to know about Wren's preparatory ideas and all the rest. And you need to, none of that initially refers to the building that's currently standing, but you need it.
Yeah.
And I think actually it's worth sort of saying that there are a few places in the series, probably not many, where actually when it came to revision, it was honestly one felt it was actually better to leave well alone because the writing was so good that even if it might belong to the moment of 1960 or whatever in his assessment and analysis, but to have started, making it right, as it were, or making it up, say, would have actually spoiled it. And I think in the Hampshire, the Northern volume, where his account of the chapel of Berkeley, decorated by Spencer. I remember thinking, this is absolutely the view of a man writing about Spencer at that time, but to sort of make it, I don't know, art historically correct for the 90s, just totally spoil it. So it was just better to say this is Pevsner's camp. It's very good, even if it looks a bit dated.
And thinking to say more about the text before we move on, or are you happy?
You can probably move on.
Yeah, I think the only thing is just as remarkable, isn't it, that design set down in 1951 for those first three paperbacks. Really, there was never much need to mess with that format. That is Pevsner.
If anyone's curious, that's from the original Warwickshire volume, so a mid-60s volume.
And we've talked about research and making text, how text is. So the other important thing, of course, is illustrations. So talk us through the sort of buildings of England illustration tradition and how that's developed in the revision.
Well, yeah, I mean, as people will probably be aware, if you look at the early volumes, they were a fairly interesting bunch of black and white photos. That's really all in the early books you got was the sort of sandwich filling of black and white photos. Not really ever, if possible, with any people in them to date them too badly, but it's quite obvious when you do look closely at some of them how old some of the pictures clearly were. And I've always assumed it was a lot of it just being drawn out of the National Monuments record, and then with some
Country life.
Yeah, exactly.
Country life.
Tony Kirsting photos and things for country life. So it was quite a mixed bag. And I think one certainly noticed sometimes there seemed to be an inordinate number of photos of, say, one building in US because that was really all that the NMR had. So they were slightly overrepresented. Then, of course, in the 70s revisions, the town maps started to come in. All hand drawn up. Much sort of remember Reg Piggott, who drew these wonderful the county maps at the beginning of the volumes, right through until I think the early 2000s, all beautifully hand drawn. And therefore that ability to kind of work around issues of page size and whatever, and all the names carefully put on and arranged. And then, of course, once we went into the larger format, much more scope for putting other illustrations, line drawings, and so on onto the page. And then, of course, really in a way, the big innovation when we moved to Yale in 2002. Was in the Yale tradition to put in colour photography. And of course, we were extremely lucky for a long time that we, as well as old archive photos, certainly in the black and white era, that the photographers at English Heritage would supply other photos that we needed of buildings that would otherwise not exist in any archive or library. And then as we went into colour, a lot of their photographers, and particularly James Davies latterly, really producing some outstandingly good colour photography, which has to be shrunk to this sort of size of page, but would have been worth hanging in a gallery, really.
And the photos we see there from the Staffordshire volume, that's I think it's a mixture of James Davis and Martine Hamilton Knight.
Yeah,
have a complementary style.
Absolutely. But yeah, I mean that changed it. I think we always were told, possibly by Bridget, that that Howard Colvin always said that he would go straight to the photos to see, what the county was really about. And of course, I think the other thing that was so important when we went colour was, of course, the materials, building stones. You suddenly really understood how counties are quite different from one another.
Yes, well, we're back to looking at buildings again, aren't we, as being a sort of central theme. And but I think if everything had been illustrated, it's too much. So this select edited choice is really quite a key introduction, isn't it?
Yeah.
But many more illustrations generally, I think, in the later volumes.
Definitely.
Yes,
many more text.
Yeah.
And you've got an example there, I think, of a watercolour.
Yes, that's of a building in Surrey. With this extraordinary marble hall. I've never actually been entirely sure whether that was realised in full, but that was supposed to have been there in the mid-19th century, and that house suffered a bad fire in about 1930. So whatever was there was totally lost.
Oh, wonderful. Obviously, in these sort of reflecting on the earlier point about research and things, there's sort of a sense that we get more building types explored in greater depth in the later revisions. I think particularly perhaps in the industrial sort of heartlands of England. So tell me a bit more about the discoveries along that route.
The two volumes you see here, it's Devon on the right. That's one of the earliest of the large format revised editions, and a serious attempt there to embrace and catch up with a great deal of scholarship and a kind of, in some ways, a sort of separate culture of building archaeology and vernacular building studies. So that is from Peter Beecham's chapter in the introduction. Bridget Cherry was the revising author, but Peter supplied the introductory chapter, showing you some of the timber construction techniques used in Devon. And the use of diagrams. There's no substitute for diagrammatic representation to understand something like that. Even photographs wouldn't really do it as well. And then on the left, industrial is a big subject, but kind of overlapping with military and naval architecture. So that's from South Hampshire, where there is a huge legacy of this Charles's volume. Of naval buildings in and around Portsmouth, which in the original series was being written were largely inaccessible and not at all well known. Now, obviously, in largely in other uses, and you can go and see them.
And
the same applies to a great many industrial buildings, which in the 50s and 60s were either still in use or mysteriously derelict and inaccessible, but might now have been converted or be in museum use or the equivalent. So they've become more knowable. And vernacular architecture, although of course these are mostly private houses or agricultural buildings, they are at least better understood.
I think it is an extraordinary thing of the series, and the Pevsner's decision, obviously, to make it broad in scope, even if his knowledge of these kind of subjects was very limited, and he acknowledged over time that he needed specialists to come in and write these sections. But it's the fact that the books were open to that. There was no arbitrary kind of cut-off. And even if he wasn't really interested in, Art Deco cinemas or whatever, other people were, and in time the books could allow for that interest to be reflected in its pages too. So I think that was just that's always been such an important strength. And I think the other thing is that even though obviously the early volumes were quite focused on things like churches, that even within those categories, the later books and revisions appeared was being able to give much better representation to Catholic churches, to non-conformist chapels, to and also just later periods, so that especially with the urban books, all that good quality 1920s, 30s church building and later that one would find in the suburban areas. So that it was always possible to keep putting, more in, really.
Well, we're looking at one of your volumes there, and I was reflecting with you earlier on about Pevsner's famous dedication of one of the volumes to the inventor of the ice lolly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So it made me think that perhaps I could ask you about how you sustained yourself on your various travels as revising authors and editors in the Pevsner tradition.
Yeah. I suppose I was luckier in that two of my volumes were on relatively small areas of London, the City and Westminster, so no problems there. But have also done county work and to do Cambridgeshire. And as I don't drive, challenges arose. But one of the solutions was to do quite a lot by bike. It's actually a very good county for cycling. And I had started out in having done Cambridge City with a sort of rather sentimental fantasy about the country pub, thinking, well, surely they're all nice. I soon found that they're by no means all nice. Some are terrible. You can serve packet soup claiming that it's homemade, or they don't serve you for half an hour, and you've got an appointment down the road, and so on. So I largely moved away from that. So what you see there is my working lunch in a Cambridgeshire church, and it happens the area I live in, North London, has a great many Turkish bakeries who do very, very good sort of savoury sort of cheese pastries and olive breads and things like that. So that was the fuel of field work, and I could have it where and when I chose. So eating in a church porch, sometimes as the rain fell outside, it's a recurrent memory of Cambridgeshire and parts of Oxfordshire.
That's very charming. Charles?
On the topic of the ice lolly, that was the Bedfordshire volume, which I revised. And so what was lovely was that when I got out those boxes of cuttings, in that pile was a letter from a woman telling us who had invented the ice lolly. And so I think, I can't now remember, I think if you read the introduction to that book, I do footnote that I think he was Canadian. Anyway, I mean, it certainly, when Bridget and I were working on the East London book, and we often did it in actually really quite exceptional weather at that time, I do remember eating ice lollies, I think, on the Hainault estate to cool down. Anyway, but I put up on the right some French onion soup because for some reason I can't really explain. This has always stuck in my mind. I'd gone to Northborough in the soak of Peterborough, on the edge of the Fend. I mean, quite far, sort of, from anything. Anyway, it had a very, and I didn't often go to the pub, but it was kind of midwinter, and I went to that pub and do remember eating this fantastic French onion soup. So it's always sort of stayed in the memory.
A dedication to the inventor. Opportunity missed. Well, in Sussex West, which was very blessed with a lot of very, very good estate farm shops, which is quite a new thing, but they were really not bad, either for sandwiches or other.
No.
I found pubs you had to wait too long on the whole, like you.
Yeah.
My big refreshment memory was too many cups of tea when I went to visit all these remote farmhouses, and it was fine when you were there, but if you forgot to use the loo before you went, find yourself in the middle of nowhere thinking, why did I have that cup of tea?
I'll say one thing. If people ever moan about, churches having kitchens and so on put in, or in fact lavatories, more to the point, was, God, that was the saving so often in, a long day of visiting. But I do remember really getting, just really being so thankful of going to one church, find not only they had a kitchen with a kettle and actually a jar of coffee that you could help yourself to, but also I found the biscuit tin. And
they've been talking about it.
Half of packaging digestive's gone.
You left a donation.
It strikes me that you've both had a really extraordinary experience of travelling around the UK. You have been more places than many people get to in their careers working guiding editors and as authors. What has that made you think about the way our towns and cities are now? Because you've really got a unique perspective on that.
Yeah, and I mean, some of it's obviously slightly secondhand because you're seeing what the authors you're working with are seeing. But yeah, it is, and I mean, I do think it's just starting with London. In the time that we were working on the series, I mean, the whole look of the city changed very, very dramatically. And I mean, Simon, you will remember better, but I know that you always had a sort of statistic about even the time that you were working on the city volume of how much of the post-war buildings were already vanished.
Whatever that was.
And then within 10 years, again, the city scape looked quite different. And I mean, some of it, is actually very good. I think I probably have much more mixed feelings about the sort of rather more kind of generic kind of development, and particularly of tall buildings that not only now are in lots of areas of London that don't particularly add anything that you'd feel if one were having to do books again, how one would approach it. But I think particularly in the big the other big English cities, it's hard not to feel worried by the scene that we saw when we were doing the city guides, which seemed in some ways full of hope because actually these were historic places that were finally getting the chance to kind of concentrate on their historic buildings, and lots of good things were going on, and actually quite a lot of creative architecture as well. That Manchester in 2002 compared with Manchester now, where there is a great deal of tall building that does significantly affect that character. So I do worry about that, and I think the other thing is just obviously the impact of the crash and then the pandemic, at the smaller town level, and also just obviously changes in habits of shopping. They feel very different now, and looking at high streets and seeing the sort of number of vacancies, and so that it is concerning when you see the huge architectural potential that these value these places still have.
We have so much that is interesting. There's again one thing that the work of you inherited from Pevsner and everyone is to remind us of all the wonderful things we have, in front of us in our local high street, in our villages. But I feel that they're getting overlooked at the moment in terms of opportunity.
Yes, the photo, I should say, it was taken at the party we had to celebrate the completion of the series in this summer. That's the English revisions, and those are all Pevsner authors, and Charles and I are somewhere there in the middle. And every one of those authors would have a different tale to tell about their area or county or counties, but it would be within a particular time frame. It might be 20 years ago or more, or it might be bang up to date. But the changes that Charles is describing, obviously, they apply in different ways in different places, and have also come along at different times. I mean, some counties aren't actually all that different from when the books came out 20 years ago, and others, say, Lancashire South East, very different indeed.
Dramatic changes, yes. I think we should get them all to write a little, or us all, to write a little memoir of, what it was like looking at our areas in the time we did, because Britain changes. We've been talking about the buildings of England because, of course, we're celebrating the completion of your series, which is an absolute sort of wonder and a joy. But it'd be perhaps nice to talk about the sort of the whole interconnected, overlapping series of Wales, Scotland, the Isle of Man, and the connection with the buildings of Ireland. I think these are all very important as well.
Oh, absolutely. Really, absolutely. And I think in a way, we were both extremely lucky to be working through and completing the English books, helping to complete them. But it was an amazing thing to be able to, in that time, to see the buildings of Wales completed, and the rather more numerous books for buildings of Scotland in the same period too. So it would have been very disappointing, if things hadn't been marching forward together. And of course, actually, the thing is, as an editor, and we slightly sort of divvied up who was doing which country, as it were, you learned an awful lot in terms of the sort of cross-border exchange from getting to know these places. And I actually was lucky that for a couple of the Scottish books that I oversaw, I did actually get to do a bit of visiting and writing there, which spoke to that side of my heritage.
Well, Simon, yes, as well.
Well, perhaps just to say, if people aren't fully up to date with how the series is continuing to develop, that the Isle of Man stands alone. We have completed the Scottish and Welsh series, including the revision of the very earliest volume for each, which was in the old small format. Ireland continues. It's not complete yet, but there are 3 volumes currently at various stages of completion. So there are more new books to come on Ireland.
Excellent. Well, I've recently been using our Irish volume, and I think they are one. You've had some fantastic authors, actually, haven't you? Across them all. But I've been very impressed with Kevin Mulligan.
Yes, indeed. Really, I think the Irish authors, while ostensibly they've perhaps got less to work with than sort of in English or Welsh or Scottish, even areas in many cases, but do an extraordinarily fine job of teasing up the significance and the character of what is there, and the stories behind the patronage and the sometimes troubled history.
And architectural history in Ireland is in a very strong place, isn't it? It's some very impressive academic departments. Isle of Man you've got on the screen, and you mentioned, and I believe I'm right saying there was no Isle of Man volume.
No,
that's not a revision.
No, that's a total new. Yeah,
brand new.
Absolutely.
Actually, you'd be interested. I met a conservation officer, someone being a conservation officer in the Isle of Man, and he said what a joy it was to have that arrive. It did. It spread awareness immediately. And I think light. Well, we're going to have to make some time for some questions that I can see are coming in. So I will. Perhaps, though, I did want to ask you a slightly more personal question. If you each, as editors or authors, wanted to pick something of which you are particularly proud, just to give us a sort of more personal insight and connection to what you've done, what would that be in each case?
Well, on the editorial side, I was quite pleased to see, relatively late in the day, that the books that I worked on were tending to join up. And by the time the series had finished, books I'd edited covered a territory that extends all the way from Dorset to the Scottish border. So there's a great strip up through, the Welsh Marches and so on in the northwest. And this isn't just a sort of marking territory. It also has a genuine value in that you begin to appreciate, when editing one volume, what the regional characteristics might be, and that was, if you like, it's always potentially a weak point with the series, in that you don't know what's just over the county boundary. You've got your county. You can read up a bit. You can see it.
It's what's just around the corner.
You are not going to go around the 3 churches along the road because they're not in your county. So you might miss some of these smaller parallels. And it was rather nice when Charles and I were both finishing volumes, Cambridgeshire and my part, and Bedson Hansel Charles's, that we were working side by side and both finishing the books around the same time, and could actually exchange some of these puzzles and encounters, and say, you've got anything like this, or I think this might be your man, kind of thing.
No, it was. That is always really interesting, seeing these things shared over a wide area. And I mean, it is sort of wrong, as it were, to sort of single out particular books that worked on, but certainly I was always very proud of Essex, which was an early one for me to edit. And at that time, I'd been working on East London. So again, that was that nice thing of sort of continuing the story outwards. And And then, as I think we said a bit earlier, we kind of divvied up territories by accident or by design. So in a kind of rerun of the War of the Roses, Simon was the Lancastrians, and I had Yorkshire. And although
small up newspaper being very myself.
So although there are actually 4 volumes for Yorkshire, the first one for the East Riding had been written by Devon and Susan Neave before I joined, but I had the kind of overall editorship of the whole of the West Riding and the North Riding, which was, I think, my last volume that I edited for the English series. So I always felt very proud of that, and that's just such an amazing county when you take it all as one entity, really.
Well, I think you both should feel very proud of what you've achieved, and I think all of us feel very grateful, both in a small way as a contributing author, but also just as a reader and a user. I think we owe you such a great debt, for bringing this wonderful, great stable and series into the culmination of a whole second wave of revisions in the way you have. So, thank you all. Yeah, thank you both, and thank you to all those you mentioned, the other contributors. I think this feels something that is there for everyone to try and discover their place, wherever they might originate from. These are the places you find yourself in, and you've got an opportunity to explore the streets and understand the stone, the brick, the wood, timber, whatever it is around you. I suspect for many, you talked about how it begins with looking and descriptions and things like that, but for many, Pevsner is probably not the Buildings of England series are, what we might nickname Pevsners, are a starting point for an interest as much as anything. They're not the sort of stopping point.
Yes.
Between you, try and create something where people can find an entry into the great stories of our buildings, small and great, in scale. And I think that's one of the most valuable contributions to my mind. So a little moment of technological excitement while I try and work out where the questions are.
I think we may need to stop.
But I can see some in a chat box, but there we go. And I have got one more question for you, but I'm going to save it to the very end. So let's find out questions from people who've joined us in this enjoyable discussion. Am I seeing them here now?
I think.
Great. So the first question.
These are just.
This is all technical stuff. Right. Bobby Drake. Just to recall an event for the 20th Century Society when I was event secretary with Elizabeth Williamson in Slough at Eton College, I think 1994, on the occasion of a Buckinghamshire revision, quite brilliant. Another event for the 20th Century Society in 2005 when London East was published, and both Bridget and you, Charles, the first time I met you, led us through the London borough of Redbridge. Can you remember that?
I do, actually. Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, actually, when one looks back, I'm always quite amazed. And actually, when we were closing up the office effectively, of course, I took away files of stuff, walk notes, things that we had done for the C20, for the Victorian Society, for local societies, Museum of London. So I was actually kind of staggered by the number of things that we had done over the years.
So you'd be asked to do lots more, right? It's a very enjoyable way of looking at architecture, let's face it.
Yeah.
Another question is from Harry Dadswell. A question about the future of the Pevsner series. How can we boost awareness amongst the young? Is it an app and a TV series? Reviving the travels with Pevsner is the way to do it? What do you think?
Well, the television series is rather wonderful. In fact, there were 2 of them, but that was a sort of gift from outside, if you like. I mean, I suspect it wouldn't have the same impact or resources to do anything like that now. As for an app, well, not quite an app, but there is a proposal to set up a digital version of the contents of the gazetteers of the books, which would work as a subscription service, subject to external funding to set it up. So it's still early days, but we would think of it not just as and something to appeal to the young, but to really all of the readership, in that it would mean that you could have immediate access to the text wherever you are, but also would preserve the interest of the books with their illustrations, with their instructions, and with that all the qualities of sort of discovery and exploration that really only a book format can still provide.
It's good to hear about that, but I think Harry has a point. There must be other ways to engage younger people in the subject that you have championed so well in these volumes. I'm pretty sure Pevsner series has been putting things on Instagram.
Yes.
Buildings in series.
Sorry. Yes. No, absolutely. We had a colleague who probably did most of that, but yes, no. I mean, we've had a presence there for a while. No, I mean, as Simon says, not just for the young. To be honest, really, it was always the question has been asked for years about when the digital will be available, and it was generally speaking, already established readers of the series who came to talks and so on, who'd been buying the books for a long time. So there was no question about the generational kind of wish for it.
Well, I think it spreads across, doesn't it?
It does.
And it is about access. But I felt the question was probably less about access, but trying to get the new audience in, which is an interesting one.
People should give the books to
give the books to your
nephews and
I do get
nieces
exactly what I give it to godchildren and so forth. The next question. So yes, other people asking about the digital and app. Gosh, everyone's onto it. Caps, come on. Elizabeth Pilar. Do any other countries have equivalents to these sorts of guides in a contemporary sense now? Yeah.
Well, I mean, actually, in a way, surprisingly, few. It is a. I mean, Simon mentioned the Hea as being the kind of inspiration. They go. I think
they continue. They're still going.
And then, of course, actually,
Germany as a whole.
Yes, indeed, including the lands to the east.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, of course, actually, the series did inspire buildings of the United States.
Okay.
But it's a rather kind of different format. I mean, just simply because of the difficulty of applying the kind of approach exactly to the States. But I think that does still continue.
Indeed, yeah.
But no, I mean, it is amazing. And of course, you are always away and thinking, where is I want my Pevsner for France or whatever.
Yeah. Please look in the Q&A box.
Yeah.
Should we carry on this set of questions first, and then we'll go in the Q&A?
Yeah, if I know where that is.
So the other question is, from James Davis, saying, I've used Claire's Manchester Guide and led an architectural tour only 2 days ago. From photographer to guide, such fun. Thank you. So that's a thank you to all. Frederick Dwyer. Pevsner's overall view of the historical development of architecture has had its critics over the years, but the philosophy underpinning the guide seems to have survived. Were these less contentious? That's a big question.
That's a big question from Freddie. Yes. Hello, Freddie. I mean, the Pevsner had agendas in that he was an advocate for modernism at a time when these things were still a bit contested. Since then, of course, we've had postmodernism and classical revival and all sorts, and it's a more plural world. I think, on the whole, we encouraged authors to have a personal response to things, but not to take a kind of what you might call a doctrinal position about which styles you should or should not use. And actually, although we know that some authors might you would place them at various points on the spectrum, everybody kind of has grasped that and has written accordingly. We don't want people. Perhaps like to provoke a bit. I don't know. I think perhaps we've tended to discourage people from being provocative, but encourage them to be interesting.
I think that's a good answer for now, because I think it's an enormous topic that we would need a little conference on to really do justice to.
Yeah,
maybe I'll go now to the Q&A because I found them on my machine. Alistair Dick Cleland is saying, where is his blue plaque, please? It's a landmark trust person.
That is Wildwood Terrace, which was his house in Hampstead on the edge of the heath. And I think that was put up in, well,
about 20 years ago.
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, it's quite sobering to realise that. Yes, so it was a house that he moved into really, early on before the war. Yes.
Yes, I think you're right. Yes.
The street was called
Wildwood Terrace.
Wildwood Terrace,
and it was. It then actually became home. It's a kind of cul-de-sac really running up to one edge of the heath. It did also become the home in the neighbouring houses for his children and their families as well. So in fact, what was lovely was the fact that obviously he was long gone from the house where the plaque was on, but the family were actually still very much there. Yeah.
An unnamed person is asking us, could you spell out Dehio and just give it the title as well so they can follow it out?
It is DEHIO, and they're called the Handbücher, so the handbooks.
Handbooks, yeah. I hope that helps. John Peverley asks, when the county volumes become out of print, will they be reprinted by Yale? And if so, will the reprinted volumes incorporate further revisions? And if the original volume had illustrations in black and white, will they be coloured illustrations? Technical question for you.
Some are already out of print. I think for the sort of earliest large format revisions, Leicestershire and Lincolnshire, I think, are both not available anymore. And no, I mean there is no plan for a new round of print publications and updated new editions for the English series. That is obviously partly why we are interested in the digital future, which might give us the opportunity to both make the text of those volumes available, but also would, in time, make it possible actually to bring things up to date. And I noticed someone had mentioned the fact that, unsurprisingly, as often happens, important buildings are still not included in the volumes because of the date at which, say the Northumberland book was done in the 80s. So obviously, yeah, it would be our hope that there absolutely is a future where the content can be updated. But I think at the moment there's no obvious sign that books that actually go out of print will be reprinted or updated.
Yes. Books are continuing to be reprinted. In the meantime, it's very much the exception. Those two volumes Charles mentioned that have gone out of print, but more reprints are coming through, and we do corrected reprints the first time a book gets a reprint after the original printing is sold out. So that process continues too for now.
So another anonymous comment is, who can forget Ian Nairn's one-word verdict on the parish church of Southbourne, West Sussex? Bad. Enough said, I think. The Mary Clausen asks, thank you for letting us sit in a most interesting convivial conversation. The Pevsner Guides originally conceived and written at a time when the discipline of history of art and architecture still followed strictly historicist models, or suffered from what Steiner called the fallacy of imitative form, the tendency of the humanities to follow the ideal of objective observation, etc., of the natural sciences. Since then, critical theory has influenced art history enormously, often resulting in changing its name to a discipline such as visual culture studies. Phenomenology is another major theoretical perspective, popular with the architectural theorists since Norberg Schultz's book, Genius Loci. So my question is, what role or position do the Pevsner Guides hold now among art and architecture historians and other academics, compared to how they were viewed in the 1950s and 60s, given this very different and dramatically expanded theoretical landscape?
Big subject.
Another conference. Give us a quick answer.
Well, if you want a corpus of things to study, then Pevsner's original volumes will give you Pevsner and his views. But even then, they were changing. He became more appreciative more plural in the things he responded positively to. But certain things continued a sort of inheritance from the formalist traditions of early German art history and architectural history, the formal analysis of space and of spatial composition and so on, and that being the primary way in which you might describe, say, a great medieval church, rather than engaging with it as a machine, or what's the word, as a site of liturgy and being taking the form it took for reasons of use. That's a sort of classic instance. I think that as we've gone on with so many contributing authors, I mean, there are 37 authors in the Revised English series and a lot of contributors as well on top of that who are supplying text, then that sort of coherence is probably frayed a bit, but perhaps not all that much. I mean, we're not heavily theoretized in terms of what we do, but we're quite happy to be talked about for people who might want to look at us through a theoretical lens.
Yeah.
I mean, are the editions much reviewed in critical academic journals? Do they?
Possibly not. I think not in the sort of ones that are more theoretically
discussed.
Yeah, yeah.
It's such a good question, but I think we've got relatively little time, so I'm just going to see if I can squeeze in a couple more. And forgive me if I haven't. There are quite a lot of questions, so forgive me if I haven't got them all in. Many of them about the future, which I think you've already touched on. To be fair, somebody is saying, would there be one on the Channel Islands?
Yeah. Well, we always had a box for collecting bits of information on the Channel Islands, but I'm afraid that was never taken forward. But never say never.
Somebody's very kindly asking you, when Pevsner finished the series, he said he would like to have a good long rest. What are you chaps doing next? You know,
I'd like to be working harder than I ever did. I'll get to that.
Yeah. Well, you're doing something now, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I mean, I've gone to work for Historic England, so they keep me very busy.
And you're working on
the listing and architectural research. So I mean, it's all
making good use of yours.
Yeah, no, and I mean, genuinely, this is the thing that the debt I owe to that job is huge, because it's informed so much now. But yeah, the rest is still some way off.
Simon, the rest?
And, well, I just published a book on Britain's railway history, and with more similar things to come. So yes, keeping busy that way.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, there are so many questions. Channel Islands, did you give an answer?
Yeah.
You had the box. You might like to know Pevsner's Frankfurt kitchen from Hampstead is now in the Kunstgewerbe Museum in Leipzig.
I have said that.
Yes. Right.
And what about further errors and omissions spotted in the revisions? Do you still collect them?
Well, we'd be happy to receive, information. It's not always, there isn't always an immediate outlet for it, but we still have some corrected reprints, and potentially with the digital version, we could certainly set things right that way.
Now, James Mackay has written in to say the earlier point of discussion, Pevsner was indeed introduced to Allen Lane in 1939 by J.M. Richards. Pevsner, stuck abroad, wrote freelance pieces to the Architectural Review from 1936, meeting Richards as his assistant editor. Penguin, I beg your pardon. Penguin published as a Pelican Richards' Introduction to Modern Architecture in 1937, and Richards. Oh, sorry, it keeps on jumping so much I can't see it. And Richards was on the Pelican editorial board, so he knew that Lane wanted to publish a.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it jumps, so I can't actually keep
History of European Architecture.
History of European Architecture. The idea was slow to mature. Pevsner, while interned as an alien, had begun to develop that idea. After he returned to London in 1941, he started serious work on it. An outline of European architecture was well underway before he was asked to succeed Elizabeth Senior as editor of the King Penguins. And that's obviously explored.
Oh, well, thank you, James.
There are other celebrations of your walk. But I think I'm so sorry, everyone. It's so nice to have all these interesting questions. A lot of questions about reprints, so those will have to feature. But I think this is our witching hour.
Yeah.
And we'll have to
I think the
say,
method is just keep writing in your own volumes. So
yes, but
keep those corrections.
yeah, but use them and make notes of anything you wish to offer as additional amendments for the future, because there may be these other opportunities or digitally, etc. And if it becomes digital, there's an opportunity to do future updates under appropriate editorial controls. So, but very, very many thanks to the Mellon Centre for hosting this, for a wonderful audience, full of questions, as you can see. And thank you to our two great editors who've done great work for us all. Thank you to Yale for seeing it through. It's really, I think, a great gift to us all. And very grateful for your time and for everything you've done.
Well, Jeremy, thank you very much. I hope people realise we did enjoy doing it.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.